The Philippines Foreign Ministry has taken diplomatic action against China over what it considers an illegal floating structure in a disputed part of the South China Sea. On Monday, the Philippines South China Sea Task Force said it found a 6-meter by 6-meter structure in the disputed Scarborough Shoal. It said the structure appeared to be manned and featured what looked like an antenna.
This is the photo of the movable floating platform that we are currently monitoring in Bajo de Masinloc.
The continued presence of the semi-permanent floating platform without consent or authorization is not only a violation of the sovereignty and jurisdiction of the Philippines.
The Hualien Islands in the South China Sea and the adjacent waters. We order you, UNCLOS, to leave this sea area immediately, right now.
Every major territorial shift in the South China Sea has begun with something small. In 1988, China seized Johnson South Reef from Vietnam after a brief naval skirmish, a feature almost no one had heard of at the time. In 1995, while the Philippines was preoccupied with domestic political turmoil, China quietly occupied Mischief Reef, starting with what Beijing labeled fishing shelters. By 2015, those modest structures had evolved into a fully fortified artificial island, complete with a runway, deep water port, and surface-to-air missiles. Strategic analysts call this pattern salami tactics. Minor violations that individually appear manageable, but cumulatively deliver decisive strategic gains. Now, in June 2026, that pattern may be repeating itself. The Philippines has formally protested China's deployment of a floating structure inside Scarborough Shoal, a disputed atoll that Philippine military and Coast Guard forces have monitored with growing alarm. Manila fears the platform is the opening move in Beijing's bid to turn the uninhabited feature into a permanent island base. Scarborough Shoal sits at the heart of shipping lanes carrying more than $3 trillion in annual commerce, making it one of Asia's most strategically valuable maritime spaces. Controlling the shoal means leverage over regional sea lanes and the power to influence, monitor, or restrict maritime activity across one of the world's most critical commercial corridors. According to analysts at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, Beijing is employing gray zone tactics operational control over contested waters while staying deliberately below the threshold of armed conflict. Each incremental step is limited on its own, but together they shift the stat quo in China's favor without triggering a kinetic military response. Manila understands this. That is why its response this time is not quiet diplomacy. It is a public, on-the-record demand delivered before an international audience, backed by legal authority and stained military surveillance. The question is whether that will be enough. This story doesn't start with a diplomatic letter or a press conference. It starts with a satellite photo and a date that Philippine authorities now believe marks the beginning of a carefully planned operation. On May 20, satellite images showed nothing unusual at the entrance of Scarborough Shoal. No structures, no platforms, jade open water. But within 24 hours, that changed. On May 21, Philippine authorities spotted 2 Chinese research vessels, the Yue Xia UG 2028 and the Yue Zhan U6, moving around the shoal's entrance. 4 days later, on May 25, satellite imagery picked up something new, a square-shaped object sitting near the southeastern opening of the atoll. From there, things moved fast. On May 30, during a routine surveillance flight, Philippine personnel saw 6 Chinese nationals standing on top of the platform. Nearby, a Chinese rubber boat was by installing an antenna on one of the reefs near the shoal's mouth. The very next day brought 4 more developments. A floating object that looked like a container drum, what appeared to be another antenna in the southern opening, the platform itself being moved from the entrance deeper into the shoal, and another floating buoy in the northern section. So what is this platform exactly? It's a movable floating structure with a deck about 30 square meters in size, held in place by 4 metal stilts that let it stay put wherever it's positioned. It's not a warship. It's not a massive reclamation dredger. It looks, frankly, modest. But Philippine officials were quick to warn against judging it by its size. Defense Secretary Gilberto Teodoro raised the alarm early. On May 30, he brought up the structure at the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore, one of Asia's biggest security gatherings. The choice of venue wasn't accidental. Manila wanted the world paying attention. By June 9th, the National Task Force for the West Philippine Sea made things official. Aerial surveillance by several government agencies confirmed the platform's presence. The latest images from the armed forces of the Philippines showed people stationed on it. And the Philippine Coast Guard's own monitoring confirmed individuals were still on board. Then, Manila made its demand. Deputy Assistant Secretary Rogelio Villanueva Jr. of the Department of Foreign Affairs didn't mince words. We urged China to withdraw and remove the platform and structures from Bajo de Masinloc, cease similar actions that violate Philippine sovereignty and sovereign rights in and within the vicinity of Bajo de Masinloc. He went even further, saying the platform's presence is not only a violation of the sovereignty and jurisdiction of the Philippines, but is also inconsistent with international law.
The continued presence of the semi-permanent floating platform without consent or authorization is not only a violation of the sovereignty and jurisdiction of the Philippines. We therefore urge China to withdraw and remove the platform and structures from Bajo de Masinloc, cease similar actions that violate Philippine sovereignty and sovereign rights in and within the vicinity of Bajo de Masinloc.
China's reply? A flat dismissal. Foreign Ministry spokesperson Lin Jian said any activities Beijing conducts at the shoal, including scientific research, are simply the legitimate rights of a sovereign state. He then turned the occasion around, telling the Philippines to stop what he called maritime infringements and provocations. The message from Beijing was, China doesn't recognize the protest. It doesn't see the structure as a problem, and it has no plans to take it down. To understand why a 30-square-meter floating platform is setting off alarms at the highest levels of the Philippine government, you first need to understand what Scarborough Shoal really is. Not JT where it sits on a map, but what it means strategically. The shoal lies about 220 kilometers west of Luzon, the Philippines' main island. That puts it squarely inside Manila's economic zone under international law. China's nearest coast, on the other hand, is more than 800 kilometers away. But distance hasn't stopped Beijing from fing its claim. Whoever controls Scarborough holds serial leverage over regional shipping lanes and gains the power to monitor, influence, or even restrict maritime traffic through one of the biased commercial corridors on the planet. About 1/3 of global trade, worth roughly $5 trillion a year, passes through these waters. But trade routes are only part of the story. For China, Scarborough Shoal is a key gateway for command and control. It's the missing piece of what analysts call the Iron Triangle, which already includes the Spratly and Paracel Island chains. If Beijing builds on Scarborough the way it built on Mischief Reef and Fiery Cross Reef, the South China Sea becomes fully triangulated. That would mean an interlocking network of fortified positions capable of projecting air and naval power across the entire waterway. Then there's the nuclear angle, which makes the stakes even higher. Former Philippine Supreme Court Senior Associate Jadis Antonio Carpio has pointed out that Scarborough Shoal sits right at the exit to the Pacific. That's the corridor China's nuclear-armed submarines, based in Hainan Island, would need to pass through to get their missiles within range of the United States. Analysts believe China is working on what's called a bastion strategy for its ballistic missile submarines, turning the South China Sea into a safe patrol zone. The chain of features it already controls leaves a big northern gap, and Scarborough is the only thing that can fill it. Air power is another piece of the puzzle. Defense economist Rocio Sali Gatdula has warned that a militarized outpost at Scarborough would put major Philippine and military bases within range of Chinese missiles. It would also let Beijing keep close watch on, and potentially block, Philippine and U.S. forces operating in the Luzon Strait, the critical waterway between the Philippines and Taiwan. There's also a legal angle that doesn't get talked about enough. Scarborough Shoal is what's called a high tide elevation. Under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, whoever holds sovereignty over it controls more than JT the rocks themselves. They also control the 12 nautical mile territorial sea around it and the airspace above. A fortified Scarborough wouldn't JT be a military base. It would become a sovereignty anchor with legally recognized buffer zones stretching in every direction. China has already been quietly laying the groundwork to lock in that claim. In September 2025, Beijing declared Scarborough Shoal a national nature reserve. Experts immediately flagged the move for what it really was: a legal and political maneuver dressed up in civilian clothing, designed to assert administrative control over the feature while the world was looking elsewhere. This is the bigger picture behind that small floating platform. It isn't JT a research station. It's a single move on a much larger board where every square counts. And China has shown, again and again, that it plays a very long game. The Mischief Reef story isn't some vague historical reference. It's a clear, well-documented story showing exactly how China turns a small diplomatic opening into a permanent military presence. It started in February 1995 when Philippine authorities discovered that China had quietly built a series of octagonal huts on Mischief Reef, a feature sitting well inside the Philippine EEZ. Beijing's first move was to deny the structures even existed. When that didn't hold, the story shifted. Now, they were jade shelters for fishermen, supposedly built with local permission. By late 1998, Filipino surveillance planes were spotting Chinese naval supply ships and construction crews at the reef. Beijing's new line? They were simply upgrading the temporary shelters into permanent ones. Fast forward to today, and Mischief Reef is a fully fortified artificial island. It has a 10,000-foot runway, helipads, hangars for fighter jets, anti-ship cruise missile systems, and advanced radar installations. The whole transformation from bamboo huts to a forward military base took about 2 decades. And the script never really changed. Deny, downplay, normalize, then build. Philippine Defense Secretary Gilberto Teodoro summed it up perfectly at the Shangri-La Dialogue IJT Look Back to 1995 in a place called Mischief Reef. There were a few bamboo structures erected there, and China said that these were temporary havens for fisherfolk. He wasn't giving a history lecture. He was sounding an alarm. BK, at the moment he said those words, he had JT been briefed on a floating platform sitting inside Scarborough Shoal. This is reminiscent of what China had done at Mischief Reef and Fiery Cross Reef, defense economist Rocio Salgadula warned, urging the Philippines to get both its diplomatic and military tools ready in case Beijing attempts reclamation at the shoal. Such a move, she cautioned, could tilt the entire strategic balance in these contested waters. Beijing's defense is pretty simple. China has sovereignty over Scarborough Shoal, so whatever it does there is legal. Case closed. But there's a major problem with that argument. An international tribunal has already looked at it, picked it apart, and ruled against it, in detail and on the public record. Back in 2016, an arbitral tribunal made several key findings. It ruled that whatever historic rights China might have once claimed in waters now belonging to other countries' economic zones were wiped out the moment China ratified UNCLOS. It also classified Scarborough Shoal as a rock under the law, meaning it's entitled only to a 12 nautical mile territorial sea. Nothing more. And it found that China had violated the traditional fishing rights of Filipinos by blocking their access to the shoal from May 2012 onward. The tribunal was very clear on one point. China's of official vessels at Scarborough Shoal had unlawfully kept Filipino fisherfolk from exercising their traditional fishing rights. The ruling didn't settle the question of sovereignty, but it directly addressed China's behavior. And what China is doing at the shoal right now fits the very same pattern the tribunal already condemned. China's scientific research XA hits another legal wall too, under UNCLOS Article 246. Anyone wanting to conduct marine scientific research inside another country's economic zone needs that country's clear, express consent. Article 248 goes further. The researching state MT give notice at least 6 months before the planned start date, with full details about what the research involves, why it's being done, how, and where. The Philippines never gave consent. China never gave notice. As Sea Light Director Ray Powell put it, UNCLOS Article 246 makes clear that marine scientific research shall be conducted only with the express consent of and under the conditions set forth by the coastal state. No consent means illegal surveying. So, when Manila files diplomatic protests, sends demarches, and publicly invokes the 2016 ruling, it isn't JT reacting in the moment. It's carefully building a legal record. Legal analysts at the Federal Bar Association have noted that these incidents prompt a fresh look at how the 2016 award continues to shape legal thinking in the region. Today's events raise direct questions about whether China's actions line up with its UNCLOS obligations around sovereign rights, environmental protection, and safety at sea. In the end, the floating platform at Scarborough Shoal is a test of Manila's resolve, a test of Beijing's appetite for risk, and most importantly, a test of whether America's treaty commitment to the Philippines actually means anything when the threat falls short of open warfare. On paper, the commitment is rock solid. The 2023 U.S. Philippines bilateral defense guidelines spell it out clearly: an armed attack anywhere in the South China Sea on either country's military forces, including coast guards, aircraft, or public vessels, would trigger mutual defense obligations under the Mutual Defense Treaty. The Trump administration has called this commitment ironclad and has backed up the words with action. That means supporting Philippine military modernization, deploying advanced missile systems during joint exercises, and setting up a new bilateral task force aimed specifically at deterring Chinese coercion in the South China Sea. Congress even authorized up to $2.5 billion in foreign military financing for the Philippines under the National Defense Authorization Act of 2026. But a floating research platform with 6 people on board isn't exactly an armed attack. And that's the whole point. A June 2026 analysis in the U.S. Naval Institute's Proceedings Journal described the pattern bluntly. China keeps coercing through water cannons, rammings, and shadowing operations carried out JT under the line of an actual armed attack. Each move chips away at the Philippines, weakens Manila's grip on contested waters, and shows off Beijing's resolve, all without triggering the Mutual Defense Treaty. The Philippines absorbs the hits, the United States issues statements of concern, and the cycle keeps going. Analysts have also warned that drawing clear red lines hasn't deterred China. If anything, it's fed Chinese maritime behavior into an even more dangerous gray zone, where Chinese vessels are willing to ram and board ships while staying JT below the line that would bring the U.S. into the fight. A floating platform sits even further below that line. It carries scientists, not soldiers. It conducts research, not military operations, at least on paper. And that ambiguity isn't an accident. Manila knows it can't handle this alone, which is why the Marcos administration has been steadily expanding its security network. The Philippines has built up defense ties with France, Germany, Japan, New Zealand, Vietnam, and India. As recently as May 2026, Defense Secretary Teodoro and Japanese Defense Minister Koizumi reaffirmed deeper operational cooperation, including the Philippines-Japan Reciprocal Access Agreement and a new acquisition and cross-servicing agreement. There's also a diplomatic opening on the horizon. The Philippines holds the AACN chairmanship in 2026, giving Manila a real chance to shape the region's direction on the South China Sea, restart stalled code of conduct talks, and build focused coalitions with fellow claimant states. The coalition is real. The legal record is real. The alliance commitments are real. But none of those things automatically stop a floating platform from quietly becoming a permanent structure. And none of them have a clear trigger point for something Beijing keeps insisting is JT a research station. That space between commitment and action is where China operates best. And that's exactly where the future of Scarborough Shoal will be decided. There's one last detail worth paying attention to, and it changes the meaning of everything we've covered so far. Satellite imagery confirmed the structure was sitting at the entrance to Scarborough Shoal's lagoon in late May 2026. But by June 1, newer images showed it was gone, not removed under pressure, not taken away because of protests. Philippine monitoring confirmed something else entirely. It had simply moved deeper into the shoal. The platform is built to be moved around, repositioned, denied, and made hard to pin down as permanent. A structure that vanishes from satellite view is harder to protest and harder to rally the international community around. This is what makes China's approach so sophisticated. It doesn't need to build an island today. It only needs to establish a presence, make the activity feel routine, and keep the option to escalate later, on its own timeline and on its own terms. The Philippines has promised to do everything it can, in national law, diplomacy, and national policy, to prevent another Mischief Reef from happening. Those words carry real weight coming from a government that has shown more backbone on this issue than any of its predecessors. The South China Sea has seen this story before. The world watched it happen, and a simple fishing shelter quietly turned into a military base.